Demonstrations in Brazil have shaken politicians and clouded the outlook for the left-leaning Dilma Rousseff, who is expected to seek a second presidential term next year. Protesters have ignored the concessions and pleas of the nation's leaders by continuing to flood the streets. Let's outline what's happening in Brazil. The wave of protests began in Sao Paulo, where the Movimento Passe Livre, or Free Fare movement, railed against a series of proposed bus fare increases. By the time lawmakers gave up on the idea, the demonstrations spread into at least 5 other cities, adding new demands for better schools, a stronger healthcare system, and less corruption. Dilma Rousseff tried to defuse a protest by proposing a plebiscite to make reforms to the political system. Congress also passed measures that diverted more of the nation's oil revenues to education and health programs. Political analysts are waiting to see how the protests will affect Rousseff's approval ratings in the new opinion polls. Her popularity was waning before the protests, hurt by concerns about taxes, high inflation, and a sluggish economy. To help us understand why this is happening, we are joined by Joao Castro at Eurasia Group. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
In your opinion, why is this happening, and have these issues been at the surface for a long time now?
I think it's a broader issue of a rising middle class over the past 10 years in Brazil, and the middle class that demands more from the government, public better services. So this is a backdrop of what's happening now. But it's difficult to pinpoint a single reason of why now. I mean, if definitely the World Cup and these huge investments in stadiums and not in the infrastructure surrounding stadiums definitely plays a part.
Well, you said the infrastructure and the investment, and many would think that with the World Cup and the Olympics coming, there would be more money coming in. So what is the potential economic impact of these protests?
Well, I think that President Rousseff's problems with the economy precede these protests. I mean, Brazil has been facing a lack of credibility in the markets and investors since the beginning of the year, or even a little bit more. So I think these protests definitely do not help. But I think on the other hand, it may increase the sense of urgency for the government to actually do something about it. And now it's yet to be seen whether this will help or not.
Well, the government is doing a few things. Congress passed some measures, as we mentioned, and they seem to be listening to the people, but they're still out there. What are they doing right or wrong, and what should they do?
Well, it's difficult. It's a difficult answer because it's also a movement against the political class in general. So whatever the political class does will not attend 100% of these interests. So I think that, of course, there's a heightened sense of urgency to do something, and not only President Rousseff, but also governors and mayors. These movements are not only aimed at the federal government, but also at the political class in general. So I think it tends to die down, these movements, over the course of several weeks, but it's going to be a risk-prone environment.
What are your thoughts on what the president has been doing so far, and what she's doing to appeal to the people?
I think she's trying first and foremost to convey the idea of boldness, bold measures. There's not much she can do to improve public services in the short term, but definitely in the run-up to next year's presidential election, I think that public spending and these issues will be much more under scrutiny than they were before. So that's a challenge for not only Rousseff herself, but political leaders in Brazil in general.
What about the long-term picture here? Do you anticipate these demonstrations continuing for much longer? Or what do you see here?
It's difficult. I think definitely after the dust settles over the course of several weeks or months, it will not be the same as it was before. I think that leaders in Brazil will be much more cautious in making decisions and when they decide to spend on projects, etc. So, but it's also tough to say that this movement will benefit the opposition, for example, because as I said before, it targets the entire political class. But in the longer term, I think that it's a story of a rising middle class that demands much more. And I think that's a challenge of governance for leaders, not only in Brazil, but in Latin America and other emerging countries, that you have to deliver more to this middle class with less, because they were facing a much harder economic environment globally.
Do you think she'll be back for the second term? Do you think she'll be reelected?
I think she's still the favorite to win the reelection next year. Her approval ratings are expected to drop. They will drop, but I don't see anyone benefiting from this yet. I think that if you were to bet on someone, you should bet on Rousseff.
All right, Mr. Castro, we appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.